Hey, community groups, I hope you're well. Just wanted to give you a quick recap of today's passage to help you along in your groups. Now, I'll confess, it took me a while to get my head around this passage. There's a lot going on, but also I wasn't really sure why Paul cared so much about his travel itinerary and passing that along to the Corinthians. So for me, the key to unlocking this passage was understanding the backstory between Paul and the church in Corinth. And so I just thought I'd give you that little quick recap in case you missed it on Sunday. So long story short, Paul, he arrives in Corinth originally in AD 50. He spends about 18 months with the church there before continuing his missionary journeys. During that time, while he's journeying around, they become pen pals, him and the Corinthian church. They write a series of questions to Paul. But around this time, Paul also picks up on reports and rumors about things just not going well in the church, sinful behavior and stuff like that. And so Paul writes back to them to answer some of their questions, but also address some of their wrong behavior. And that response is what we have in the book of 1 Corinthians. After he writes 1 Corinthians, though, he sends them that letter. He hears report that things are continuing to go downhill for them. In fact, things have sort of hit crisis point. And so Paul, he decides to make an emergency visit to the Corinthian church straight away to try to straighten things out. Unfortunately, it does not go well. This is what scholars refer to as Paul's sorrowful visit. And it's what Paul is referring to in 2 verse 1 when he speaks about a past painful visit. We don't know exactly what happened there, but Paul had just some confrontation with people in the church and it just ended badly. So Paul heads back to Ephesus where he was at the time. His heart's broken in two, feeling a lot of grief over this struggling congregation. And decides to write them a letter out of that grief to try to bring some healing. And scholars call this the sorrowful letter. And it's what Paul's referring to in 2 verse 4 when he says, "I wrote to you with many tears out of an extremely troubled and anguished heart." So that's a bit of the backstory about that painful visit and painful letter. But somewhere along the way, it gets a little bit worse for Paul because he actually promised the Corinthians after this painful visit, he promised he'd come back, spend some more time with them, help them along a little bit more, comfort them, all that sort of stuff. He says he'll do that soon, but Paul never shows up. Instead of going to Corinth before traveling on to Macedonia, Paul heads straight to Macedonia instead. And it's clear that this decision to change his travel plans brings just their relationship is at breaking point. And so part of what Paul's doing here in the book of 2 Corinthians is, and especially in these verses, is he wants to explain why he changed his travel plans and why he made that decision. And there are two things, that's the backstory. There are two things here in this passage that Paul's doing to try to convince them that his decision was out of a pure motive, out of a pure heart. The two things is, he says, I postponed my trip. First, an emotional reason. It was actually for the sake of the Corinthians themselves. So key here is 1 verse 23. I call on God as a witness on my life that it was to spare you that I didn't come back to Corinth. Then again, 2 verse 1. In fact, I made up my mind about this. I would not come to you on another painful visit. So Paul knows that the emotions are still raw. He knows that they still need a bit more space and time to heal. So he decides not to visit him just yet, like he said he would, not in order to spite them, but in order to spare them, because he doesn't want to cause any unnecessary pain. He doesn't want to open up wounds that are still healing. That's the first reason, an emotional reason. Second reason, though, is a theological reason. Not only did Paul make his decision out of the good, for the good of the Corinthians, but it is also for the good of the gospel. That brings us to 2 verse 12 and 13. Paul talks about having an opportunity. I believe that the better reading here is that he had an opportunity, a door opened for him to bring the gospel to Macedonia straight away while Paul was in Troas. He could bring the gospel to Macedonia straight away instead of going to Corinth first, and Paul takes up that opportunity. So Paul is saying, hey, I'm a man under orders. I serve a God who I endeavor to follow his will, follow his prompting, And so part of what Paul is doing is saying, I didn't come to you just yet because I wanted, well, because God was pushing me to go to Macedonia now. So that's a bit of an overview of the passage. Paul, he is talking about his travel itinerary because it had caused so much angst in the congregation, and he's writing them, pleading with them, saying, hey, all the choices I've made have been out of a sincere heart for you. I did it out of love for you because I didn't want to cause any pain, but I also did it out of love for the gospel as an opportunity opened up for me to preach in Macedonia. There's obviously more going on in the passage, but I reckon once you've got that, you're able to sort of unlock what's going on here. So I hope that's helpful. I hope now that as you look at the study questions, that I'll be able to just color in some of those gaps for you. All right, love you guys. See you soon.